Um, when you begin to point out this difference in the otherness, this is really helping to eradicate any guilt any sort of well thinking Europeans might feel and prevents others from questioning the institution, or at least one presumes that they're not really going to be questioning everything. So you're combining these ideas of science and progress and racism. So these ideas that biological race is not just an issue of skin color, but also of certain social characteristics, of all of which make the Europeans and consequently white Americans and Canadians as the elite race. So they're taking one of Charles Darwin's points from The Origin of the Species, in which Charles Darwin is explaining the biological differences in different species, saying that certain species who happen to have advantages to other members of their species, they're the ones that are going to be the most likely to survive, to breed, and to pass on these characteristics. And this is called survival of the fittest. Now, Darwin meant this simply in terms of biology. So there are others who sort of take this idea and they try to apply this sort of biological aspects of passing on certain characteristics and say, okay, you can also apply this to race. So rather than looking at humanity as a group, there is a distinction that each individual race is a separate category of humanity, with Europeans at the top, and generally the darker you are, the closer you are towards the bottom. So Herbert Spencer is going to apply Darwin's theory to humans. The idea that each race, that the white race is on top because they have the best characteristics, and because we breed, because we expand, that is what makes the white race the best. So this is how European imperialism is justified, even though imperialism does use quite a bit of force. And even against other Europeans. If you look at South Africa, there are numerous wars in South Africa between the British imperialists, between the Dutch Voortrekkers or the pioneers, the individuals who are descended from the original Dutch colonies, and then, of course, the various African societies in that area, in which Voortrekkers and South Africans themselves are basically sent to concentration camps during the gold rush and during the diamond rush, so the British colonists can get in there and actually try to gain the wealth first. So this increased knowledge of the surrounding world tends to encourage that sentiment, and the lack of formal institutions like schools, gender roles, nudity, or a lack or syncretic version of Christianity is going to emphasize that as well. So if you don't, you might have schools, there's all this culture, but because it's not Western culture, the West is then going to deem any sort of other culture as inferior. And this emphasis on racial prejudice is going to be used by all imperial powers, the America, Europe, and Japan, and they're bolstered by their own superiority. So the tools of empire, because this is very important. What's enabling the West, and of course Japan in the South Pacific, to really penetrate further, to really take control of this large new territories, more so than they were able to do during the Age of Exploration, is all coming down to the technology produced by industrialization. That is your fundamental contribution. Canals are shaping lands and waterways. Railroads to be able to move troops back and forth. Telegraphs so you can get information back, not just in a particular area, but from London to Suez to India. Steamships can now move farther around the world. And this is going to be repeated in China and the Middle East, allowing the imperialist powers to have better communication. And then, of course, most importantly, military technology, because while there is definitely negotiation involved in this, most of the negotiations or the agreements have to be enforced by violence. So military technology, breech loading rifles, so no longer the individual loading muskets, the Maxim and the Gatling guns, repeating rifles, so much easier to deal now with opposing natives. So, very much not the same issue that we saw in the American colonies. We're also going to be seeing laws introduced. Now, remember that slavery, there was a great deal of interplay between the various African tribes as Europeans would sell guns to Africans. Africans they aligned with in order to gain more slaves. This sort of racial justification means that the sale of arms to any other race is now going to be banned. And that even if you do have native soldiers in Kenya and India, anything like that, say the sepoys of India, you're going to keep very, very firm control over the guns. There's also going to be very strict laws in place against anyone of a native background attacking a white man. Not so for the reversal for that. So it's all creating this image that the white man is above all reproach. So, in conjunction with all this, there is still a need to work with the native population because obviously this violence is only going to get you so far. You placate them and then you give in a little bit. You try to work out a working relationship. And generally, you want to try and work out things out diplomatically before you have to use military force because that means soldiers, that means money. Let's try to avoid that. And so if we're going back to India, it was a major necessity for the British in India to retain control. And it was easier for them to do this by allowing Hindu Indians into the lower levels of bureaucracy and also into the armed forces, the sepoy, because this would help police the population. So this integration of lower levels of natives is very helpful for the use in formal imperialism. This is used quite a bit in the British colonies in Africa. Because if you use some native institutions to retain order, you're going to retain or sort of favor the established political system in order to retain benefits. So lower level chiefdoms in Africa are going to become part of the British hierarchy. And when they do that, there are some of them, because the reaction is very, very different from individual to individual. Some of them are going to be a little bit more inclined to allow this British oversight if they're going to see some kickbacks. And this tends to work in India, the Dutch East Indies, Indochina, or what we know as Vietnam. By building upon the earlier economic ties of trade until Western institutions are directly influencing economic affairs through political control, and all to benefit themselves first.